Nina stared at the imposing iron gates of Parkview Manor through the rusty fence that separated the public park from the grand estate. Her torn shoes scraped against the gravel path as she kicked a small stone, watching it bounce off the metal bars. The sound of laughter and chatter from other children playing in the park behind her only emphasized her solitude. Living in the poorest part of town with her grandmother, who could barely make ends meet, Nina spent most of her afternoons in this park, not for play, but searching for anything valuable that careless visitors might have dropped. Coins, lost jewelry, or even unopened food packages. It wasn't much, but every little bit helped at home. Today, however, something different caught her attention. A brilliant flash of blue and gold feathers swooped down from the manor's direction, landing on a branch just within her reach. It was the most beautiful parrot she had ever seen, its plumage gleaming in the afternoon sun like precious jewels. The bird tilted its head, studying her with one bright eye. Nina held her breath, afraid to move and startle the magnificent creature. To her amazement, the parrot didn't fly away. Instead, it hopped closer along the branch, seeming almost curious about her presence. "Hello," Nina whispered, extending her hand slowly, palm up, the way she'd seen people do with friendly dogs. The parrot bobbed its head up and down, then, to her complete surprise, spoke in a clear, almost human-like voice. "Mr. Peterson hides gold," the parrot squawked, then repeated more quietly, "Gold in the walls." Nina's eyes widened. Mr. Peterson, she knew that name. Everyone did. He was the reclusive owner of Parkview Manor, a wealthy businessman who rarely left his estate. Some said he was eccentric, others called him mysterious, but all agreed that he was one of the richest men in town. "What did you say?" Nina asked, her heart beating faster. The parrot ruffled its feathers and hopped even closer. "Gold in the walls," it repeated, then added in a different voice, one that sounded like an old man's. "Nobody will ever find it." Before Nina could ask anything more, the sound of footsteps on gravel approached. A stern-looking woman in a maid's uniform appeared on the manor's side of the fence. "Perseus, there you are, you naughty bird," the woman called out. The parrot immediately spread its wings and flew back toward the manor, leaving Nina standing alone by the fence, her mind racing with questions. That evening, as Nina helped her grandmother prepare their modest dinner of potato soup, she couldn't stop thinking about the parrot's words. Her grandmother noticed her distraction. "What's troubling you, child?" she asked, stirring the thin broth with a wooden spoon that had seen better days. Nina hesitated. Her grandmother had always taught her that secrets were heavy burdens, and sharing them could make the load lighter. But this secret felt different. It wasn't hers to tell, and yet it weighed on her like a stone. "Grandmother," she began carefully, "if you knew something important about someone else, something that might be wrong, what would you do?" Her grandmother set down the spoon and turned to face her, wisdom etched in the lines around her eyes. "That depends, my dear. Could keeping this secret hurt someone?" Nina thought about the parrot's words, gold in the walls. Was it stolen? Was Mr. Peterson hiding something sinister, or was it simply the random babbling of a trained bird? "I'm not sure," she admitted. Her grandmother nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps you need to learn more before deciding what to do. But remember, whatever you discover, always let your conscience be your guide." That night, lying on her thin mattress, Nina made a decision. She would return to the park tomorrow and try to learn more. If Mr. Peterson was hiding something wrong, she would find a way to make it right. But if the parrot was just repeating meaningless phrases, she would let the matter rest. As she drifted off to sleep, Nina couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. The parrot's words echoed in her mind. Gold in the walls. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a mystery that would challenge everything she thought she knew about right and wrong, wealth and poverty, and the true meaning of treasure. The next morning dawned grey and misty, matching Nina's uncertain mood. She helped her grandmother with their morning chores, all the while planning how she would investigate the parrot's strange message. As she swept their small front step, a newspaper carried by the wind caught against her feet. The headline caught her eye, Local business pioneer Mr. Peterson announces charitable foundation. Nina picked up the paper, her hands trembling slightly. The article described how Mr. Peterson was establishing a foundation to help underprivileged children in the community. The photo showed an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, nothing like the mysterious recluse she'd imagined. This new information only confused Nina more. Was this the same man who was hiding gold in his walls? Could someone who wanted to help poor children also be hiding something wrong? The mystery deepened, and Nina knew she had to learn more. She couldn't have known then that her curiosity would lead her down a path that would uncover secrets far more valuable than gold, and that the real treasure wouldn't be found in any wall, but in the most unexpected of places. The park looked different in the early morning light. Nina arrived just as the sun began warming the dew-covered grass, hoping to spot Perseus before other visitors arrived. Her grandmother thought she was doing her usual morning collecting, and Nina felt a twinge of guilt for not telling the whole truth. As she approached the familiar iron fence, she noticed something unusual. The stern maid from yesterday was outside, struggling with several heavy bags of groceries while trying to manage the gate's complex lock system. Without thinking, Nina rushed forward. "Let me help you," she offered, reaching for a bag that was about to slip from the maid's grasp. The maid hesitated for a moment, studying Nina's worn but clean clothes and earnest expression. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you, child. These old hands aren't what they used to be." Together, they carried the groceries through the gate and up the winding path toward the manor. Nina's heart pounded. She hadn't expected to find herself inside the grounds so easily. The mansion looked even more impressive up close, its stone walls covered in climbing ivy and its windows gleaming in the morning sun. "I'm Mrs. Crawford," the maid said, her stern expression softening slightly. "And you're the little girl I saw talking to Perseus yesterday, aren't you?" Nina nodded, worried she might be in trouble, but Mrs. Crawford just smiled. "That bird has caused more mischief than you can imagine, always repeating things at the most inappropriate moments." They reached the kitchen entrance, and Mrs. Crawford paused. Instead of dismissing Nina, she looked thoughtful. "You know, I could use some help organizing these deliveries. Would you like to earn a few dollars?" Nina's eyes widened. The chance to earn money and possibly learn more about the mystery. It seemed too good to be true. "Yes, please, Mrs. Crawford." The kitchen was enormous, with gleaming copper pots hanging from the ceiling and countertops that seemed to stretch forever. As they unpacked the groceries, Mrs. Crawford kept up a steady stream of conversation, revealing small details about life in the mansion. Nina learned that Mr. Peterson lived alone except for the staff, that he spent most of his time in his study, and that he was known for his generosity to his employees. Perseus was his wife's bird, Mrs. Crawford explained, as she showed Nina where to store the vegetables. "Mrs. Peterson passed away years ago, but that parrot still repeats things she used to say. Sometimes it's like her ghost is still here, speaking through him." Nina's hands stilled on a bunch of carrots. Does Perseus always tell the truth about what he hears?" Mrs. Crawford laughed. "Oh, that bird mixes up everything. One time he repeated my secret cookie recipe to the gardener's wife, but sometimes," she lowered her voice, "sometimes he reveals things that make Mr. Peterson quite uncomfortable. That's why we keep him in the conservatory most days." As if summoned by their conversation, a familiar squawk echoed from somewhere above. Nina looked up to see Perseus perched on a high window ledge, his blue feathers catching the sunlight. "Gold!" the parrot called out. "In the walls. So must hide it all." Mrs. Crawford shook her head. "There he goes again with that nonsense. Ever since Mr. Peterson started renovating the East Wing, Perseus won't stop talking about gold in the walls. But don't pay him any mind. It's just something he picked up from somewhere." Nina wasn't so sure it was nonsense. As she helped Mrs. Crawford finish organizing the kitchen, she noticed small things that seemed odd, like the way Mrs. Crawford tensed whenever Perseus spoke, or how she quickly changed the subject when Nina asked about the renovations. When they finished, Mrs. Crawford paid Nina and asked if she'd like to come back the next day. "We're preparing for a special dinner party, and I could use an extra pair of hands. Mr. Peterson always hosts a celebration before announcing his charitable projects. Nina agreed eagerly, but as she walked home, her mind was churning with questions. Why would Perseus keep talking about gold if it was just nonsense? And why did Mrs. Crawford seem nervous about the renovations? At home, she found her grandmother talking to their neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who worked as a cleaner at the local bank. They were discussing the news about Mr. Peterson's charitable foundation. It's strange, Mrs. Thompson was saying. The bank's been busier than usual lately, with all sorts of people coming in and out of Mr. Peterson's private vault. And now this sudden announcement about a foundation. Nina's ears perked up, but her grandmother noticed her eavesdropping and shooed her away to do her homework. That night, Nina couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Perseus's words, the renovation, the bank vault, and the upcoming dinner party. The next morning, Nina returned to the mansion, arriving even earlier than before. Mrs. Crawford seemed pleased to see her and put her to work immediately, polishing silverware for the dinner party. As Nina worked, she observed the comings and goings of various staff members and delivery people. One conversation particularly caught her attention. A well-dressed man arrived, introducing himself as Mr. Peterson's lawyer. He spoke to Mrs. Crawford in hushed tones, but Nina caught fragments of their discussion. The paperwork must be finished before... transfer everything before the announcement. Careful about who knows. The lawyer left, looking worried, and Mrs. Crawford's hands shook slightly as she returned to her duties. Nina pretended not to notice, but her mind was racing. What were they trying to hide? Later that day, while helping to clean the conservatory where Perseus lived, Nina found herself alone with the parrot. The beautiful bird swooped down to a perch near her as she dusted the plant stands. "Hello again," she whispered. Perseus tilted his head, studying her with one bright eye. Then, in a perfect imitation of Mr. Peterson's voice, he said, "Must protect them. Must hide it all before they find out." Nina's heart skipped a beat. The parrot's words seemed more urgent now, more meaningful. But before she could hear more, footsteps approached. Nina quickly resumed her dusting as Mrs. Crawford entered the conservatory. "Nina, dear, would you mind helping me prepare the dining room? The party is tomorrow and everything must be perfect." As Nina followed Mrs. Crawford out, she glanced back at Perseus. The parrot was watching her intently, as if trying to tell her something more. She had a feeling that tomorrow's dinner party would reveal secrets that someone was trying very hard to keep hidden. What she didn't know was that her simple act of kindness in helping Mrs. Crawford with the groceries had set in motion events that would uncover a truth far more surprising than anything she could have imagined. The real mystery wasn't about gold in the walls. It was about something far more valuable, something that would change not only her life, but the lives of many others in ways she couldn't yet understand. As she walked home that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the park, Nina felt both excitement and fear about what the next day might bring. Something big was about to happen at Parkview Manor, and somehow she had become part of it all. The day of the dinner party arrived with an unusual commotion at Parkview Manor. Nina arrived early, finding Mrs. Crawford in a state of controlled panic as delivery trucks lined the curved driveway. Workers carried in flowers, extra chairs, and elegant table settings. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," Mrs. Crawford said, ushering Nina inside. "We need all the help we can get. Start by helping in the kitchen." The cook's beside herself with all the preparations. As Nina worked, she noticed the mansion seemed different today. There was tension in the air, like the quiet before a storm. The staff moved quickly, speaking in whispers, and everyone jumped whenever Mr. Peterson's voice echoed from his study upstairs. While arranging flowers in crystal vases, Nina overheard two maids talking in hushed tones near the kitchen doorway. "Did you see all those documents Mr. Peterson was burning last night?" "Shh! We're not supposed to talk about that. Besides, the lawyer said everything needs to be done properly." Their conversation cut off abruptly when they noticed Nina. She kept her eyes on the flowers, pretending she hadn't heard anything, but her mind was racing. What documents were they burning and why? Perseus's voice suddenly rang out from the conservatory. "Burning papers, burning secrets." The maids hurried away, looking uncomfortable. As the afternoon progressed, Nina found herself assigned to help prepare the grand dining room. The massive table gleamed with polished silver and fine china. While carefully placing name cards at each setting, she noticed something odd. There were cards for bank executives, city officials, and several people identified only by their initials. Mrs. Crawford appeared behind her, making Nina jump. "Careful with those cards, dear. Mr. Peterson was very specific about the seating arrangements." She paused, studying Nina's face. "You know, you remind me of someone. There's something about your eyes." Before she could continue, a crash from the kitchen demanded her attention. Nina remained in the dining room, her heart pounding. She'd seen a strange look pass over Mrs. Crawford's face, almost like recognition. While adjusting a slightly crooked place setting, Nina noticed something fall from one of the fancy folded napkins, a small key. She picked it up, intending to return it to Mrs. Crawford, but something made her hesitate. The key was old and ornate, unlike the modern keys used in the mansion. A door opened upstairs, and Nina quickly slipped the key into her pocket. Heavy footsteps descended the main staircase. Mr. Peterson was coming down. Nina had yet to meet him face to face, and she quickly busied herself with the table settings. But instead of entering the dining room, Mr. Peterson's footsteps headed toward the conservatory. Nina crept to the doorway, peering around the corner. She saw an elderly man standing before Perseus's perch, his back to her. "You've caused quite enough trouble," Mr. Peterson said to the parrot, his voice stern but not unkind. "Tonight must go perfectly. Everything depends on it." Perseus ruffled his feathers. "Gold in the walls must protect them." Mr. Peterson sighed heavily. "Yes, old friend, we must protect them, just like she wanted." Nina withdrew quietly, her mind spinning. The way Mr. Peterson had spoken to Perseus suggested the parrot's words meant something real, something important. But who was the she he mentioned, and who were they that needed protection? As evening approached, Nina helped light candles and make final adjustments to the dinner settings. Guests would be arriving soon. Mrs. Crawford had asked her to stay and help serve, offering extra payment that Nina knew her grandmother desperately needed. While carrying fresh towels to the powder room, Nina passed Mr. Peterson's study. The door was slightly ajar, and she heard voices inside, Mr. Peterson and his lawyer. "Everything's prepared," the lawyer was saying. "Once you make the announcement tonight, there's no going back. Are you absolutely sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Mr. Peterson replied firmly. "It's time to right an old wrong. I only wish I'd had the courage to do it sooner." Nina continued past the door, her pulse racing. Whatever secret lay hidden in Parkview Manor, it would be revealed tonight. But as she rounded the corner, she collided with someone, a wealthy-looking woman who had arrived early for the party. "Watch where you're going, girl," the woman snapped, brushing off her expensive dress. Then she stopped, staring at Nina's face with an odd expression. "Good heavens, you look exactly like—" "Mrs. Blackwood. Welcome." Mrs. Crawford appeared suddenly, steering the woman away. But not before Nina saw the same strange look of recognition she'd noticed on Mrs. Crawford's face earlier. As guests began arriving, Nina helped serve drinks in the grand hall. She observed the rich and powerful of the town mingling, their jewelry glinting in the chandelier light. Many seemed nervous, checking their watches and whispering among themselves. Perseus's occasional squawks could be heard from the conservatory, making several guests jump. Nina noticed Mr. Peterson's lawyer moving through the crowd, having intense private conversations with various officials. Then Nina saw something that made her freeze. On a side table near the study, partially covered by a guest's coat, was an old photograph. She glimpsed it only briefly, but the image burned into her mind, a younger Mr. Peterson standing with a beautiful woman who was holding a baby. The woman wore an ornate key on a chain around her neck, a key that looked exactly like the one in Nina's pocket. Before she could look closer, Mrs. Crawford whisked her away to help in the kitchen. But as Nina carried a tray of appetizers back to the party, she heard Perseus's voice rise above the crowd's murmur. Time to tell, the truth comes out tonight." The parrot's words seemed to hang in the air like a prophecy. Nina touched the key in her pocket, feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic. Something told her this key would unlock more than just a door. It would unlock secrets that had been hidden in Parkview Manor for years. As Mr. Peterson called for everyone's attention, preparing to make his announcement, Nina's heart thundered in her chest. The truth was about to be revealed, but she had a feeling it would be far different from anything anyone expected. Even her. The real mystery wasn't about gold hidden in walls. It was about something far more precious, a secret that had shaped lives and destinies, and somehow Nina had become part of it all, though she didn't yet understand how deep her connection truly went. The grand hall fell silent as Mr. Peterson stood before his guests. Nina watched from her position near the kitchen door, still holding her serving tray. The elderly man's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses, but his voice was strong and clear. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began. "Some of you may have heard rumors about my recent activities, the frequent visits to the bank vaultoir, the renovation work, the establishment of a new charitable foundation. Tonight, I'll explain everything." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. For a brief moment, they seemed to rest on Nina, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Many years ago," he continued, "I made a terrible mistake. In my pursuit of success and wealth, I lost sight of what truly mattered. My wife, Elizabeth, tried to show me the error of my ways, but I wouldn't listen." Perseus's voice suddenly rang out from the conservatory. "Elizabeth's treasure, Elizabeth's heart." Several guests jumped, but Mr. Peterson smiled sadly. "Yes, Perseus, Elizabeth's treasure indeed." He turned back to his audience. "My wife had a heart of gold. She saw suffering in our community and was determined to help. She started a secret fund, selling her jewelry and investing the money, planning to build a home for children in need." Nina's hand unconsciously moved to the key in her pocket. In the crowd, she noticed Mrs. Blackwood dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Elizabeth was especially moved by the plight of a young woman who worked at the factory I owned back then. Mr. Peterson continued. "The woman was struggling to raise her daughter alone. Elizabeth helped them secretly, ensuring the child had food, clothes, and eventually an education fund." Mrs. Crawford appeared beside Nina, gripping her arm gently. The older woman's eyes were fixed on Mr. Peterson, but her grip on Nina's arm suggested something more. But then, Mr. Peterson's voice cracked slightly. "Elizabeth fell ill. Before she passed, she made me promise to continue her work. To my shame, I didn't. I was angry at the world, at God, at myself. I sealed up her private study, hid away her documents, and tried to forget." Nina felt the key burning in her pocket. A study, a locked room. Suddenly, pieces began falling into place. Perseus was Elizabeth's beloved companion. Mr. Peterson gestured toward the conservatory. She would tell him everything as she worked in her study, planning her charitable projects. After she passed, his constant repetition of her words became too painful for me to bear. But now I realize he wasn't just repeating, he was reminding me of my promise. The parrot's voice carried clearly, "Gold in the walls. Must protect them." "Yes," Mr. Peterson nodded. Elizabeth had hidden her fund's documentation and resources in a safe behind the study walls. The gold Perseus speaks of isn't just physical wealth. It's the golden heart of my wife's mission to help others. Nina felt Mrs. Crawford's grip tighten. The older woman was crying silently now. "The renovation work you've heard about, that was me, finally opening up Elizabeth's study after all these years. The visits to the bank, accessing her hidden accounts, which had grown substantially over time, and now..." He took a deep breath. "I'm not just establishing a charitable foundation, I'm fulfilling Elizabeth's final wish. The foundation will build not just one home for children in need, but several. And the first will be named after the little girl Elizabeth helped all those years ago, a girl who grew up to become a remarkable young woman, though she never knew who her benefactor was." Mr. Peterson's eyes found Nina again, and this time they held her gaze. "That woman was your grandmother, Nina." The serving tray slipped from Nina's hands, crashing to the floor. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent hall. Every face turned toward her, but Nina barely noticed. Her mind was reeling. "Your grandmother worked in my factory," Mr. Peterson continued gently. "And your mother, she was the little girl Elizabeth helped. They never knew it was her. She wanted it that way, but Elizabeth kept track of them through the years, even after your mother—" He trailed off, but Nina knew what he meant. After her mother had passed away, leaving Nina to be raised by her grandmother. "When I saw you in the park that first day," Mrs. Crawford said softly beside her, "you looked so much like your mother. She used to play in that same park when Elizabeth would secretly watch over her." Perseus flew into the hall, landing on a nearby chair. Elizabeth's treasure, Elizabeth's heart. With trembling hands, Nina pulled out the key she'd found. This was hers, wasn't it?" Mr. Peterson nodded. "Elizabeth's key to her private study. It must have fallen from the old box of her belongings I had brought down for tonight. Another sign, perhaps, that it's time for the truth to come out." Nina remembered the photograph she'd seen, Elizabeth wearing this very key around her neck, standing happy and proud with her husband and a baby. Now she understood why so many people had looked at her strangely. She shared her mother's features, and her mother had apparently looked just like her childhood benefactor, Elizabeth. "The gold Perseus speaks of," Mr. Peterson explained, "was never just about money. It was about Elizabeth's golden heart, her secret mission of kindness. She believed that helping others was the greatest treasure one could have, and she was right." He walked over to Nina, his eyes filled with tears. "I've spent years hiding from my promise, from Elizabeth's memory, but seeing you here, looking so much like your mother, like Elizabeth herself, I knew it was time. Time to reveal the truth, time to fulfill my promise, time to continue Elizabeth's legacy." The room was silent, except for Perseus's soft murmuring of "Elizabeth's heart, Elizabeth's heart." Nina felt as if her own world had shifted, revealing a hidden dimension she'd never known existed. All this time, her family had been connected to Parkview Manor, to Elizabeth, to a legacy of secret kindness that was finally coming to light. But as Nina stood there, surrounded by the wealthy guests and the evidence of a decades-old secret, she realized this revelation wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something new, something that would change not just her life, but the lives of many others, just as Elizabeth had always intended. The party guests began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about Mr. Peterson's unexpected revelation. But Nina remained rooted to the spot, the ornate key still clutched in her hand. Mrs. Crawford kept a gentle arm around her shoulders, while Mr. Peterson dismissed his guests, thanking them for coming. "Would you like to see it?" Mr. Peterson asked softly, approaching Nina once the last guest had departed. "Elizabeth's study has been sealed all these years, but it's time it was opened again." Nina nodded, unable to find words. Together, they climbed the mansion's grand staircase, Perseus flying ahead of them as if leading the way. The Parrot landed on a decorative sconce near a door at the end of the east wing hallway, a door Nina hadn't noticed during her previous work in the mansion. Mr. Peterson gestured to the lock. With trembling hands, Nina inserted the key. It turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. The door swung open with a gentle creak. The study was like stepping into a time capsule. Everything was exactly as Elizabeth had left it, preserved under dust covers that Mr. Peterson and Mrs. Crawford now helped remove. A large desk dominated the room, its surface covered with leather-bound ledgers. Bookshelves lined the walls, and in one corner stood an easel with a half-finished painting, a view of the park where Nina had first met Perseus. Elizabeth loved to paint while she worked, Mr. Peterson explained, his voice thick with emotion. She said it helped her think, helped her plan how to help others without drawing attention to herself. Nina approached the desk, drawn to a framed photograph she spotted there. It showed Elizabeth kneeling in the park, helping a small girl feed the ducks. With a start, Nina recognized her mother's face in the little girl. "Your mother never knew Elizabeth was helping her," Mrs. Crawford said softly. "None of the families did. Elizabeth believed that true kindness didn't need recognition." Perseus landed on the desk, his bright eyes scanning the room. "Elizabeth's heart. Show them, show them." Mr. Peterson moved to a particular spot on the wood-panelled wall, pressing something Nina couldn't see. A panel swung open, revealing a hidden safe. "This is what Perseus has been trying to tell us about all along," he said. "Not just the physical contents, but the purpose behind them." From the safe, he withdrew several folders, their pages yellowed with age. "These are Elizabeth's plans, her records of all the families she helped, her dreams for the foundation she never got to build." He handed them to Nina. "I think she'd want you to see these first." As Nina carefully opened the folders, she found detailed notes about her own family, her mother's progress in school, her grandmother's work situation, small victories and struggles that Elizabeth had monitored from afar. But there were other families too, other children who had received anonymous help over the years. Elizabeth believed that wealth was only valuable if it helped others. Mr. Peterson continued. "She kept track of every penny she invested, every life she touched. And now—" He paused, looking at Nina with tears in his eyes. "Now it's time to continue her work, properly this time." Mrs. Crawford stepped forward, holding another photograph she'd found on a shelf. This one showed Elizabeth at her desk, writing in one of the ledgers while Perseus perched nearby. She would talk to him for hours, Mrs. Crawford remembered. In planning, dreaming, sharing her hopes for all the children she wanted to help. That's why he kept repeating those phrases. He was trying to preserve her mission. Nina looked at Perseus, who was now investigating an old pencil holder on the desk. The parrot had been Elizabeth's confidant, the keeper of her secrets, patiently waiting all these years for someone to understand his message. "But why me?" Nina asked, finally finding her voice. "Why did Perseus choose to tell me?" Mr. Peterson smiled gently. "Perhaps he recognized something of Elizabeth in you, not just in your appearance, but in your heart. You came to the park not to play, but to help your grandmother. You stopped to help Mrs. Crawford with her groceries, expecting nothing in return. Those are exactly the kind of quiet kindnesses Elizabeth believed in." Nina's eyes filled with tears as she looked around the room again. Every corner held evidence of Elizabeth's secret mission of kindness, her careful plans to help others while remaining anonymous. It was overwhelming to think that her own family's story was woven into this legacy. "There's more," Mr. Peterson said, reaching into the safe again. He withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, with Nina's mother's name written on it in elegant handwriting. "Elizabeth wrote this letter years ago, hoping that someday, when the time was right, it would reach your family. I think that time is now." Nina took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, she found a letter written in the same elegant script. "My dear friend, if you're reading this, then the time has finally come for the truth to be known. I've watched you grow from a small girl feeding ducks in the park to a strong young woman, and my heart has filled with joy at every step of your journey. You never knew me, but I knew you, and helping you has been one of my life's greatest privileges. I believe that true wealth lies not in what we keep, but in what we give to others. My greatest hope is that this legacy of quiet kindness will continue, touching more lives in the years to come. Take care of your daughter, and know that you are both part of something larger than yourselves, a chain of kindness that, I hope, will continue to grow and flourish long after I'm gone. With love, Elizabeth." Nina couldn't hold back her tears any longer. The letter had been written for her mother, but somehow it felt like Elizabeth had known it would eventually reach Nina herself. Perseus flew to her shoulder, gently preening her hair as if trying to comfort her. "Elizabeth's heart," he said softly, and for the first time, Nina fully understood what he meant. The real treasure hadn't been gold hidden in walls. It had been the golden heart of a woman who believed in helping others without seeking recognition or praise. As the evening sun cast long shadows through the study windows, Nina realized that her simple curiosity about a parrot's strange words had led her to discover not just a secret, but a legacy, one that was now partly hers to carry forward. Part 6. That night, Nina walked home with Mrs. Crawford, carrying Elizabeth's letter and a heart full of revelations. She found her grandmother sitting in their small living room, waiting up despite the late hour. "Grandmother," Nina began, her voice trembling, "there's something you need to know." As Nina shared the evening's discoveries, her grandmother's eyes filled with tears. She remembered the mysterious help that had arrived during their hardest times, money appearing just when they needed it most, scholarships for Nina's mother's education, anonymous donations that had kept them afloat. "I always wondered," her grandmother said softly. "Sometimes I'd see an elegant woman watching from a distance when your mother played in the park. She seemed so kind, but I never dared approach her. That was Elizabeth, wasn't it?" Nina nodded, sharing Elizabeth's letter. As her grandmother read, years of uncertainty and gratitude finally found their answer. "All this time," she whispered, "we had an angel watching over us." The next morning, Nina returned to Parkview Manor, not as a helper, but as an honored guest. Mr. Peterson was waiting in Elizabeth's study, where Perseus had made himself at home on his old perch by the window. "I spent the night reading through Elizabeth's records," Mr. Peterson said, gesturing to the ledgers spread across the desk. "She helped dozens of families over the years, all in secret. And now with the foundation, we can help even more." He turned to Nina with a serious expression. "I'd like you to be part of this, Nina, not just as a beneficiary, but as someone who can help carry Elizabeth's legacy forward. You understand the importance of quiet kindness, of helping others without seeking recognition. Would you consider joining the Foundation's board?" Nina's heart swelled. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I'd be honored." Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth's study became a center of activity. Nina spent her afternoons there after school, helping organize the records and learning about the families Elizabeth had assisted. Perseus watched over their work, occasionally offering his commentary with fragments of Elizabeth's wisdom. Mrs. Crawford shared stories about Elizabeth, helping Nina understand the woman whose legacy she was now part of. "She would have loved seeing this," Mrs. Crawford said one afternoon, watching Nina work at Elizabeth's desk. Her mission continuing through someone so much like her in spirit. Part 7. As summer turned to autumn, the first of Elizabeth's planned children's homes opened its doors. Nina stood beside Mr. Peterson at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, thinking about how a parrot's strange words had led to this moment. The building was beautiful, with large windows and a garden where children could play safely. Perseus had a special perch installed in the home's library, where he would entertain the children with his chatter. His warnings about gold in the walls had transformed into gentle reminders about sharing hearts and helping hands, as if he too had found a new purpose. Nina's grandmother was offered a position as the home's resident grandmother figure, sharing her wisdom and love with children who needed it. The sight of her rocking little ones to sleep in the sunny reading nook became a common one. Mr. Peterson, no longer burdened by his long-held secret, seemed years younger. He devoted himself to expanding Elizabeth's work, with Nina's help ensuring that her vision of quiet, dignified assistance remained at the heart of every project. One evening, as Nina sat at Elizabeth's desk finishing some foundation paperwork, she found a previously undiscovered notebook tucked in a drawer. Inside, in Elizabeth's elegant handwriting, was a quote that brought tears to her eyes. "The greatest treasures we possess are not those we keep locked away, but those we give freely to others. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, creates ripples that touch distant shores we may never see." Perseus, watching from his perch, spoke softly. "Elizabeth's heart lives on." Nina smiled, understanding now that the real mystery she had helped uncover wasn't about hidden gold or secret rooms. It was about the lasting power of kindness, the strength of promises kept, and the way love could echo through generations, touching lives in unexpected ways. The mansion that had once seemed so imposing to her was now filled with purpose and life. Children's laughter rang through its halls, and its gates stayed open to those in need. Elizabeth's dream had not only survived, it had grown into something even more beautiful than she might have imagined. As for Nina, she had found more than just answers about her family's past. She had discovered her own purpose, carrying forward a legacy of quiet kindness that would continue touching lives for generations to come. Perseus still spent his days between the mansion and the children's home, no longer needing to repeat his urgent message about gold in the walls. Instead, he shared new phrases, picked up from the work being done in Elizabeth's name, helping hands, caring hearts, and love grows, kindness flows. And so, a parrot's seemingly nonsensical words had led to the unveiling of not just one secret, but to the revelation of something far more valuable. The truth that the greatest treasure anyone can possess is the ability to help others, and that the truest wealth lies not in what we keep, but in what we give away. Nina often thought about how it all began, with a curious girl, a talkative parrot, and a mystery about gold in the walls, but what had seemed like a story about hidden treasure had turned out to be something far more precious, a tale of love, legacy, and the endless ripples created by simple acts of kindness. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of captivating stories. I trust you found today's narrative as engaging as I did. If you enjoyed this exploration into fascinating and compelling narratives, kindly indicate your appreciation by liking this video. Are you watching on mobile? Show your appreciation with a double tap for hype. For more captivating stories and journeys into the heart of compelling storytelling, please subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss a single upload. Your thoughts and interpretations are most welcome. Please share your perspectives on today's story in the comments below. And if you believe others would find this content engaging, please consider sharing the video with your network. Until our next journey into the world of captivating tales, I bid you farewell.